Okay, so welcome everybody to week 6 and the final session of the Surviving High Prices webinar series. We're very excited that y'all are here today, and thank you to all those who have joined any session or all sessions. I think it's been gone really well. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about reproduction, some stuff behind genetics, as well as just some strategies, the economics behind those. But first off, I think some of these guys wanted to talk about a little bit what's going on in the market right now, just to kind of address some of the things that have been said and some questions. So we'll take a little bit of time to do that right here at the beginning. I think Dr. Anderson, you're going to kind of start that off for us.
Sure, and I think I'm going to kind of lead our discussion on the actual topic for today, and I'll share my screen after that. But
Hmm.
we were kind of talking about this morning about, hey, maybe we ought to say a little bit about I guess I had an extension program last night. I told the audience I was really blessed to get to work in such a calm industry with no volatility or no big disturbances. It was just really nice. Everybody's happy. It's just a great place to be. And luckily they took it pretty good and they laughed. But the last week and a half's been one heck of a roller coaster. Um, really, as I've done 7 extension programs in the last week and a half. Unfortunately, they fell right in the middle of all this turmoil.
Hmm.
But I think the main thing, we certainly see this at prices when they're really elevated like this, at these record highs, particularly the futures market. That's where these headlines and social media things and things like that just really have a big effect. And and I think the other thing that's interesting for the futures market, it wasn't just one comment. We went from a comment about Argentina that we'd import more. Uh, then a comment about beef prices are too high. Then what's interesting to me too is another kind of teachable moment for folks is that the next kind of big comment was that cattle prices are too high. But they were talking in the context of beef. So I've had to actually remind people that cattle are different than beef. But there was even a FMD comment thrown in there on live TV. There's been headlines on Brazil and China. And so we've had this waterfall cascade of stuff. But I think the main thing, as I look at it, and I let everybody else kind of weigh in too, I think the main thing is this had a huge effect in the futures market for sure. But really, fundamentally in the marketplace, nothing's changed. We still have the fewest cattle since 1960, beef cows since 1961. We're producing less beef. Our imports are bigger than they were last year. Our exports are smaller. Beef production's lower. Fundamentally, nothing has changed. And I think we see a big reaction in the futures market. I think it's also a good reminder that the futures market is not the same thing as the cash market, but they are related. And one of the things we're going to see is how this shakes out over the next week as all of our auctions start having their weekly sales in the middle of the futures market coming back up double digits today. I think early this morning we were up over $12 practically every contract. So man, this is a poster child for volatility and price risk management, I think.
I think you're right, Dave. And the thing sticks out to me in speaking with the group this morning was, we say all the time that futures markets are information forums, right? I mean, that's one of their, as new information comes along, that's where people go to, you know, bet on it. Bet's not the right word, but they go to, if they think prices are going up, you can go to the futures market to take a position there. You think prices are going down, you can go to the futures market to take a position there. And so it's not a surprise that that's where we're seeing the volatility from what's happened over the past couple of weeks. But you're right in terms of what the key is going to be is how does this translate to what we actually see at auction markets? I know Oklahoma City was down pretty sharply this week. Um, got some comments from some auctions in Alabama that were not down near as much as Oklahoma City was down. So it's going to be really interesting to see this week, next week, how this thing kind of smooths out. And I do think it's going to smooth out.
I'm interested also in the, if cap prices come down like this, how does that change people's view of holding back heifers to expand or not? Does it encourage them to say, gosh, maybe I'll just take the money now? Uh, if the price is low enough, does it make holding it more worthwhile for the future? So, this is happening at a, gosh, it's almost, this is happening at an interesting moment in terms of uh, heifer retention and expansion and things like that. That yet this drives down the price that might make us less likely to hold back more heifers, and then just prolongs high prices. So it's really happening right at a point in time that's really pretty critical. So I don't know. I've sort of relied on this idea that fundamentally, really nothing much has changed from a selling strategy. I think we were talking, Hannah, we were talking before we clicked on the whole Zoom here. I think it's really difficult. If you don't have to sell this week, be a nice time to just kind of sit back and let's wait and let this shake out. I think, historically, selling into a panic is not really the best thing if you can help it. And sometimes we can't help it, but if you can kind of wait and let things shake out, I think that's probably a pretty good strategy right now.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think, like you just said, and you and Josh, just focusing on still where we're at fundamentally in this cycle, that um, focusing on that, remembering that we still have the lowest supply and consumer demand still really strong. So I'm just gonna have to wait this out a little bit for
Yeah, and
sure.
I think if somebody's got in our audience have got some questions on this area and wants to
Hmm.
talk, this is great. I see this as part and parcel of this whole series that we've done. Uh, but I'll jump to our slides unless anybody else has any other comments. I'll see if I can. Well, God Almighty, let's see if I can remember how to share my screen.
While you're doing that, I'll go ahead and do just some brief introductions. We've had all of our speakers on before during the series, but again, today we have Dr. David Anderson from Texas A&M University. We have Dr. Brian Mills from Mississippi State University and Josh Maples as well from Mississippi State. And then you're actually going to get to hear from me a little bit today, and you can tell me at the end if that was a good thing or not, but we're all going to be talking a little bit about reproduction. Okay, there we go. It looks good, Dr. Anderson. So I'll
Cool.
hand it over to you.
Okay, so you know what? The first thing I guess I want to say is I want to thank Max Runge and Ken Kelly for getting this whole dang thing started. They put together this idea of meeting back in the spring, really to talk about a lot of these ideas and, surviving high prices, expanding strategies in a changing market and everything. And so I really want to thank them for doing it. I also want to thank Hannah for ramrodding this whole thing and herding us cats, because that's about what this is like, herding cats to get us all on these things on every week. This has been, I think, great fun for me, and I hope everybody else has enjoyed it too. But I have certainly enjoyed it, and so I want to say a big thank you to you guys right off the bat. As we started this meeting, or we'll put this together, we got to talking about ideas. What did we think were big topics? And I threw out this one that's been on my mind a lot. And I think I called it defining improvement, or what is improvement? What is herd improvement? What is cattle improvement? And really thinking some about what that really is. And so that, we got to talking about it a little bit, and I thought, well, shoot, I thought this might be an interesting topic that we talk about, because I think we're all engaged in some part of excuse me, that we're all engaged in some part of this. We all know people who are cattle producers. We talk to them. We see different people doing different strategies all the time. And and so I'm going to let that idea kind of guide this. I got 4 or 5 slides, but we're all going to throw in lots of ideas and topics around 3 areas. One is goals. What's that producer's goal? I think the second one I'm going to kind of hit on are tools that people are using. What are people doing to kind of get to those goals? And then the last one is going to be economics. As economists, we may have a different goal in mind than some others because usually it revolves around money, and so and making money, and so that might guide us as well. And so that's kind of the basic idea. And so as we talk about this, I think we're all going to have some examples and stories and of different goals and what people are doing to get there. And does it work or not? And so that's really kind of the idea where we thought we would go with this. So the first thing I'd point out in this idea of goals, I think quite honestly, if we looked around, there are almost as many goals as there are producers. I mean, you talk to people, lots of people have different goals. Um, and sometimes that's driven by how much money they got. And as we think about that, what is someone's goal? And I threw a couple of them here. Uniformity, grade, looks, low cost, premium prices, production, things like that. As when Ken and Max put this thing together, we went to two different cattle producers ranches in Alabama. One was very much driven by profit. This was a commercial operation, both crops and livestock, cover crops, very both cow calf and stocker, but very much driven, I would argue, by profit. And so it very much had the idea of understanding costs, their budget, what they were producing, what they were selling, and when, where they bought, trying to buy things right, if you will. So that was one, not necessarily low cost, but very much focused on profit. We went to another one that was more of a, I don't know what I'd call that, selling replacements, very much involved in some of the newer and newer technologies that we'll talk about in a minute, but really had made great strides in their Angus herd. Every animal was uniform. Every one was the same. That was their goal, and they were selling into a replacement market, not necessarily, commercial cow calf, but a different market niche. And they certainly worked on that as their goal. And so there were two examples. We had two great examples right there in that day of two different goals going on and what they were trying to do. Some of these are going to flop over between these, but I want to, we might think about, what is that person's market niche? Where are they selling? Are they a commercial herd selling calves? Do they also do stockers? Do they retain ownership? Are they in the business of selling replacements? Are they selling bulls? Whatever that is, that also changes kind of what the goals are and what you're trying to produce, I think, going forward. I want to tell a story about goals in this case. And on my second bullet, I just said grade. And by that, I mean USDA quality grade. And I had the opportunity a number of years ago. I happened to be sitting at my desk and the phone rang and I picked it up, and it was a rancher from Texas who said, you got time to talk? I said, sure. He said, I want to bounce some ideas off of you. And I said, well, great. We proceeded to talk for about an hour and a half. And this was a rancher who 20 years ago, more than that now, had certainly bought in fully to the idea of I'm going to retain ownership. I'm going to produce cattle that are going to grade prime, grade high choice. I'm going to sell on a grid. Changed over his entire cow herd from really, commercial crossbred cows to Angus cattle. Had gone out and bought the bulls that everybody said you should have for this, very much with an idea of grade. And he had recently got back his closeouts on his cattle that had gone through a feedlot, and they had graded very well. In fact, a majority graded prime. The others were all high choice, and he got price premiums, as we see in the marketplace. And he got to looking at it, and he realized that also a whole bunch of those cattle also were yield grade 4s and 5s and took a discount. And by the time you factored out the premium for prime and the discount for yield grade, he had made about $10 a head more on those than the others after taking the pluses and the minuses. And he's looking at his books, and he said, I've done all this. I did what? I signed on to these programs. I jumped in. I did this. And he said, I'm looking at this 20 years now. And I look at my feed bill and what it cost me to keep those cows together over the winter. Much more than I ever spent on my regular old, plain old commercial cows. And he said, as I look at this, I think I have messed up. And, and I knew where this was going. He said, I'm spending way more money on my feed bill over the winter than I'm ever making back in terms of price premiums for grade. And so what he was looking at doing was actually going back to what he used to have and then just buy good bulls and go back to his commercial herd, because it was actually, he was looking at his stuff, it was actually more profitable for him to do that. And so where I'm going with that story is, we pursued this goal here and we achieved that goal, but there was also some negative parts of the goal. And that's where I think you really got to kind of know what exactly you're trying to sell. Because what we look at when we look in these markets, there are different factors that make money at the cow-calf side versus the retained ownership side. In feedlots, it's daily gain. It's those kinds of efficiency measures. On the cow-calf side, it's something different. And so a lot of these goals can actually work in opposite effects. So that's the first thing as I think about goals. And I hope if somebody wants to weigh in here and jump in, I'm all for it, or we'll wait to the end. I think the other interesting thing where I'm involved in a lot of really applied research with some pretty interesting grad students in our animal science department are some of these tools. If I look down here on my list, the tools that we select animals with, the first one's always been our eyeball test, right? You just look at them, and that becomes pretty important. Sometimes it'll fool us, but that becomes pretty important. I think EPDs are an interesting area that, certainly more and more producers are using, and a heck of a lot more of them now than ever before. One of the things I find interesting is if you were to look at, some of our breed associations have 25 or 30 of them on all kinds of different traits. If you get to looking at them, some of them work together. Some of them work at opposite to each other. And some of them may not apply to you at all. And so my story about choosing those animals that graded, if I'm a cow-calf producer, I may not care one bit about that, because I'm not going to get rewarded for that. I'm going to get rewarded for the production traits of those animals in terms of profits on the ranch. I think the other interesting thing is I put in here indices of multiple traits. Lots of different people have calculated or developed indices. A bunch of them are profit driven, net return driven, and they have various names. I think one of the interesting things there is you might want to ask and find out what goes into that index. Because one of the interesting things is, are the right things in the index, and then how are they weighted? And that's the part that you don't really see much of. You don't see how was that calculated? And so I think that's an interesting part of EPDs, and I get more and more questions from audiences about them all the time. We're doing some interesting stuff with some grad students in terms of looking at profits and economics of things like artificial insemination in a commercial herd, time synchronization together with AI. Really interesting things looking at the profitability of those versus natural service. certainly, everybody knows somebody doing embryo transfer and how that works and all of this. I think the next really interesting area is going to be genetic testing and knowing what animals, what bull the calves came from, for sure, what traits they're getting. And as we start to look at more and more genetic testing to fine tune the herds that we have, I think that's going to be an interesting tool. So as we look at all these tools, there's a heck of a lot of choices, which bring us back to whatever our goal was to begin with. That I think is pretty fascinating, really in the whole industry. Oops. There we go. The next one, and quite honestly, my last prepared slide, because I hope this is going to kick off a discussion. When we look at it as in economics, our goals may be very different than economic. By economic, I'm thinking a profit motive. And so if we think about what delivers profits, with all the things we might do with cows, I think the first thing you got to have is cows that thrive in the location they live, that they're fit to the environment that they're in. Now, this came to my mind because a comment last night at the program I was doing, fellow said, "Hey, did you see?" He had made a comment about his cattle as we drove in, and he said, "Some of them aren't very pretty to look at." Well, and everybody laughed, and he said, heavily Brahma influenced. And I just said, you know what? You have to have that in the location you are, because that's the only way they're going to survive. And then he goes, yeah, that's exactly right. That's why we have them. I have cattle that are gonna do well down here on the coast, and that means hot, humid, bugs, Brahmas, and so he certainly has cattle that fit the country that they're in. If we look at the cow-calf side, if we look historically, the top determinant of profits is that you have a live calf to sell. After that, it's pounds and other stuff, but you really have to have animals that are reproductive, that have a calf, and those calves survive, and you got something to sell forever. That's the most important determinant of profit in this. But every segment then has different things that drive profitability, all the way from cow-calf all the way through the beef. And at different levels, it's different traits that are important. I might say something about price premiums, my kind of bottom bullet. I've had the good fortune to work with a colleague here, Samuel Zapata. We've done some work with some of our county agents who went to a bunch of auctions, and we recorded prices for individual animals and their traits, their characteristics. And what we've done with that data is it started with a question really I had focused on, we've had a lot of programs where we'll have buyers come in and they'll talk to the audience about what kind of calves are the top of the market. What are their traits? And they'll run some calves through the auction ring there and show you what's the top of the market. My question was, how close are most producers to having that optimum set of traits? How close are they? Are they really far off, or are they close up? And so what we did with this data is we took a look at, the cattle that were in these auction markets, commercial, regular old weekly sales. How close were they to having the optimum set of characteristics or traits that top the market? What we found out was like 70% of the calves either, I won't say were perfect, they had the exact set of traits, or they were only one characteristic different, which means that most of the calves were pretty dang close. Very few of them were 2 and 3 and 4 things away. And some of those things that were those characteristics are things that are pretty easy to fix. Other ones were breed and things like that are going to be different. So I found it pretty interesting that we had a pretty significant proportion of calves going through the auction that were actually the traits that would bring them the best price. They didn't have to do a whole lot in terms of their calves. And we often say as price takers in markets like this, there may not be a lot we can do about price. There's a lot we can do about costs. And again, going back to choosing the kinds of animals, how we treat costs, how we do some of this stuff, if we're really driven by an economic and a profit motive. So, that's so when we get back to this idea of defining improvement, I think we have a huge amount of improvement going on. I was going to do a slide that showed the percent of cattle that are grading prime. We all know that that's where the growth in demand for beef has been for more prime, more high choice, more branded products. 2 months, well, let's see, in May, over 13% of the cattle that were graded prime. In fact, that month, I use that month because more larger percent graded prime than graded select, which is a huge change. Clearly, we're responding to signals to produce beef that meets that consumer demand. But we also got a whole bunch of other goals going on in here as well. And how we define improvement may vary by every operation. But I should say too, Charlie Martinez, I don't know if Charlie's with us today, but Charlie and I were talking about this topic too, because we were basically making fun of each other. But this idea of defining improvement, how we improve, and is it an economic signal? Is it some other goal that we have? So that's kind of the last official side. I wanted to work in some stories here about operations that I think we can all relate to, what people are doing in successes and failures. And, is the quote improvement we're doing actually an improvement or not? Because we might think some about that too going forward. So that's my last slide. I want to open it up to any questions. Hannah, Brian, Josh, whoever wants to jump in with some of these ideas, I think that would be great.
David, I'll throw one thing in there while folks are thinking of questions if they have any. But what I would just say is I hear you talk and it makes me think about the idea of revenue maximization versus profit maximization. And some of the topics that we cover in classes in particular. And I think about the beef sector, the cattle industry, and you're absolutely right. As a group, as a sector, as an industry, we've absolutely moved the needle. We're producing better quality beef, more beef from fewer cattle. Um, but for each individual producer, you've really got to look at that profit maximization for your own ranch or your own farm. And so really, really good comments there to make sure you're doing what fits your herd best, your forage program best, your area, your environment the best. So good comments there.
It's certainly true. We can have, we get we've done this where I've got to produce more pounds, which is, becomes a little bit of a revenue maximization idea, which may lead us to calving earlier in worse weather that increases our costs. And we've kind of missed the profit maximization part of it. But yeah, we may have sold more pounds, but it may have cost us a lot more money to get there. I think that's a common thing that has happened that people have sort of figured out over time too.
Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to unmute, or you can throw them in the chat. I know you're probably still thinking of some.
You'll notice I didn't pick on anybody's particular breed. or lack of breed, hell, it's whatever it is,
Well, your comment about the Brahmin influence, we definitely hear that down here in Florida. I mean, that's just something we have to fit our environment. So all the Florida people on here, we definitely know, we understand
Absolutely.
that.
And they do great in that environment.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned about cattle grading prime, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Have the standards changed any for cattle grading prime? It seems like I mean, I know the genetics have improved and we've got more cattle that are improving to grade prime, but it seems like the meat I see in the grocery store that is grading prime now doesn't quite look like the meat that I was accustomed to growing up that used to grade prime. And so I was just curious if the grading, standards have changed a little bit to include more beef for prime or what really has gone on.
I'd probably argue that it hasn't, at least in the last lots of years. One big change in grading is moving from uh, human graders to computer grading. And one of the issues in that certainly was how do you calibrate the camera that takes the picture so that the what it calibrates against is actually what prime is supposed to be, or choice, or select. Um, and so there was a lot of questions about that, and did that contribute to more or less prime or things like that? I think, I tend to think that they probably did a pretty good job calibrating the camera to what it's actually supposed to be. But I think one of the things the camera does is you get a much more consistent grade. Um, People, we can be a little subjective, and having done a little bit of research on camera grading versus human grading, one of the things I think the camera grading done has tightened up the the grades to more like they're supposed to be. It's taken a little bit of the subjectivity out of it. Um, and so I don't think that the grade has changed. I don't think that's what's causing more prime. I think it really is a lot more, as you mentioned, the genetics, the feeding for longer times, more days, more weight, more pounds on the animal. I think that's got a lot more to do with it than necessarily changing the grade.
Okay. So you think it's more our system of grading is more consistent nowadays and that we're a little bit better at getting a good standard prime grade.
I think that's right. I think
Okay.
that's right.
I was thinking, I mean, I'm getting kind of old now. I'm in my mid 40s, but I was thinking back when I was in college, we used to say,
Young man,
yeah, I was thinking it was somewhere around, cattle, we only had about 3% or so that used to grade prime back, 20, 25, 30 years ago.
right?
And, like you mentioned, it's went up considerably. And I was just kind of curious because I know, like I said, a lot more stores and restaurants now are carrying prime graded beef. And, it doesn't quite, like I said, it doesn't quite look like what I remember it looking like, when I saw prime back in my college days.
I think we do produce, and you know what? That was always the thing at a fancy steak place. They'd always say only 2% of the beef in the U.S. qualifies for what we're going to serve you. That's
Right.
our how good our standards are. And then they'd say it was prime, and about at that time, about 2% graded prime. Now, just plain a lot more is meeting that standard, a lot more beef, and quite honestly, I attribute that to really the growth of value-based marketing from the 1980s and the beef quality audit, and that we changed our marketing system to reward uh, quality, to reward what the cattle were rather than average prices. And I think that markets work, and I think this is a pretty great. I was going to say pretty prime example of markets working and premiums making this change happen.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. I appreciate that.
Oh, I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
It's a pretty interesting part of all this. That's another technology thing. That camera grading, you couldn't have done that without computers. And the technology there is a pretty interesting change.
Yeah. Great question. Thank you for your question, and also Dr. Anderson for those great comments. Great questions, great discussion, but I want to make sure we have time for the other topics we're going to talk about today. So we'll go ahead and move into those, and then we may go over a little bit of time today, but that's okay. We'll address any other questions that anybody may have. So Next up is Brian and I'm going to do the first half of this presentation, and he's going to do the last half. So we're really going to just talk about some repro strategies, with the first one being breeding season management, and then he's going to cover a little bit about AI versus natural service. And so with the breeding season management stuff, I am going to talk about, having a controlled breeding season and all of that. But a big point of this section is going to be about making sure we have efficient cows and having practices that help us keep track of how efficient our cows are, making sure we got calves every year, how good they're raising those calves, things like that. So that's what this first half is going to be about. If I can get it to click through. There we go. Okay, so I have this slide on here. Reproduction, we all know the standard rule. We want one calf on the ground every year, every 365 days. And I've got these different, I guess, segments, as you will, throughout the year. We've got, she's going to calve, she's going to feed that calf, then she's got to rebreed, she'll wean, and then she starts the process all over again with getting bred and gestating. And really, the only portion of this whole process that producers make any money is the weaning process. Every other section, we're pretty much spending the money that we have. So what can we do in all of these other sections to make sure we're making the most that we can at weaning when we sell those calves, giving us the best chance of managing our cows economically and working towards profit maximization. So this, I just wanted to throw this in here. I'm sure we all are aware of the gestation length and process of a cow, but I wanted to just show what we're starting with, what we have to work with when we're talking about reproduction. So this is a graph that Dr. Ganella here at UF put together and has used several times. So we've got our breeding day here at day 0. She's going to gestate for about 283 days. Then she's got about 83 to 85 days to get rebred before the whole process starts back over again. So this whole green part in the middle is what we're working with to make sure that she gets rebred on time so that we can have that calf every 365 days, because that's how we define what the ideal cow or the most efficient cow would be. So just wanted to kind of start off with that. Okay, and this is something that I worked on with her as well as a fellow agent, Callan Waters, up in the panhandle of Florida. So I'm going to show this graph twice. So this one's going to be a scenario talking about without a breeding season, how the efficiency of cows really affects how many calves we're selling over time, and then obviously how much that's influencing the money that we're spending and making over time. So her whole scenario is kind of using the Golden Girls type theme. So we've got Dorothy, Blanche, Sophia, and Rose here. And Dorothy would be our ideal, dream cow, calf on the ground, consistently every 12 months. We've got Blanche here. She's all right, but she needs an extra 30 days of recovery time. So over time, that puts her back a month. And so eventually she's going to skip a year where she's got a calf on the ground. And then so on and so forth with Sophia and Rose here as well. They need 2 extra months of recovery or maybe 3 extra months of recovery. So over time, that really adds up to how many calves on a calendar year or your fiscal year, wherever you're operating, how many calves you're making. So when we total that up after, maybe she's in production for 10 years, just for simple math purposes, we can see right there the number of calves is altered based on her efficiency. So to kind of put some numbers to that, as an economist, we have to have, graphs and tables and everything. So I just wanted to put this together. This is variable cost and returns for different calving intervals after 10 years. So say she stays in the herd for 10 years. So average cow cost per year, and this is on, hold on, here we go. This is on a national basis. I just pulled this from the national database. So this is obviously going to vary region by region. But so let's say on average per year, we're spending about $900 on her. So her total cost after 10 years is going to be a little over $9,000. Average calf revenue, just averaging that out over 10 years, also using some historical data, about $1,000 per calf. And so we do all that math based on how many calves they've had each year. And we can see over time, who the ideal cows are, the most efficient ones, the ones that can get rebred within that window and give us a calf on the ground every year. And so this next table is basically the same thing, but instead of a time frame, let's say we just keep her in the herd till she has a certain number of calves. And in this situation, it would be, we're going to wait till she has 10 calves to give us. And so it's basically the same thing. It's going to take her longer in this third column here, years to produce 10 calves. It's just going to take her longer to meet that goal. So now we're putting more money into her. And this goes back to that point that Dr. Anderson made about cost management. Maybe we can't do a whole lot to improve what our calves look like, but we can do something about how we're managing how those calves get on the ground. So you just follow that throughout this whole chart. And again, we see that ideal cow of, she's most efficient. She's going to give us that calf consistently every year. So just wanted to give those illustrations. Let me move this up. So now we're going to kind of transition into a controlled breeding season and some points of why we preach this so much in extension to our producers. So some variables that can be quote unquote controlled by a producer with having a breeding season is you can monitor and track when those cows are getting bred and when they should have calves on the ground. You can then work into trying to get more cows bred earlier in the season for heavier calves. And then you can ultimately sell a more uniform calf crop, which we preach that all the time as well. And so controlling those types of variables, gives you a little bit more influence over your pregnancy rates, weaning rates, and weaning weights. And all of those things influence the money we spend and the money we take home. So this is the same thing with a breeding season, however, just to show you the same thing. The ideal cow every 12 months, going to have it with this scenario, she's going to have a calf on the ground every year in September. With Blanche, she needs that extra month of recovery. So eventually by 2020, she is not going to be able to fit into that breeding season window because she didn't recover in time. So in 2020, she's going to miss a calf. In 2025, she's going to miss a calf. And so on and so forth with Sophia and Rose. As they need more time to recover, they're not going to fit into your breeding season window. Therefore, they're going to have to eat for a whole nother year basically for free because they didn't give you a calf to sell. So when we look at that again, we can see the calves produced over a certain production time period. So these are those same tables that we looked at without a breeding season. Same thing here. We're putting about the same amount of money into all 4 of those cows, but because they didn't give us the same amount of calves after that period of production, we see that Dorothy is our ideal cow again because she is most efficient. And this goes back to the point as well of are we keeping open cows because we really like them, or are we keeping them because we think they're a good cow? And what really is a good cow? And a good cow would be one that, has a calf on the ground roughly every 365 days. So this is the same chart again with just this is after 10 calves. So we can see again, we're putting more money into these non-efficient cows and it really pays off or doesn't pay off in the long run. Okay, this is that scenario again, but I've highlighted Blanche, Sophia, and Rose. You can see with the blue rectangles, they're having a calf within that breeding season or the calving season window, but each year it goes further and back into the breeding season. So those calves, we assume, are going to weigh a little bit less at weaning. So that's also another thing to remember with efficiency is we want to have as many cows calving early in the season as possible. So this is a chart, just some tables putting this together. So let's say we've got one cow, Dorothy, I guess. She's breeding within 30 days of the season, 60 days, 90, and 120 days. We're going to compare those cows and calves. So let's say they're all born at the same weight. They all gain about the same amount before weaning, but they're all going to have different weaning weights because of when they were born. And so that ultimately is going to affect their value. And we can see these differences in this last row down here, that total value difference, seeing how weight and when they were born really influences their value. And this is just kind of putting everything together. So your weaning rates, as your weaning rates increase, you're going to have more calves to sell. And then the more calves you can have early in the season is going to influence more pounds to sell. And that's what we ultimately mostly are working with is cow-calf producers selling weaned calves. And so we can just see from this chart, and y'all will have access to all of these as well, but we can just see the more calves you have and the more pounds you have, likely the better you're going to do. So I wanted to show that. And then this is just some survey data from Cattle Facts. We can also see here the tighter, in this graph on the left, the tighter that the calving season length is, the tighter the season. We usually see these weaning weights a little bit higher. And then that second graph on the right, the shorter the calving season length also influences how many calves you're going to wean. So just wanted to show those visuals as well. And then just some takeaways. So it can be a little hard to preach some of this stuff when calves are bringing what they're bringing, regardless of, the recent announcements and things going on. It's hard to kind of preach, adopt these management strategies when they can make so much money with just by weaning them straight off the cow and taking them to market. It's also hard when we probably culled all of our older girls, all old cows out of the herd, and we're trying to expand. But however, I hope this point has been made that efficient cows that can maintain that 365-day calving interval are really vital to a cow-calf operation, no matter the situation, because a cheap calf or maybe a low-value calf is still better than having no calf at all. So we want to make sure we have as many calves as we can to sell each year. It's also going to just help you keep better track of which cows are the most efficient in your herd, because you know when they should get bred, you know when they should be calving. So it just helps a little bit with record keeping. And then the kind of point of preaching this right now in the current cattle cycle is maybe we have a little bit of extra profits that we can put into making some of these management decisions. And one example would be kind of a two birds, one stone type scenario. We sell some cull cows in a high market, sell those cows that don't fit into your breeding season window, get a pretty penny for them. And so you're also working, by doing that, you're working towards establishing a breeding season and then possibly also improving your forage management. Maybe you've got more cows than you really need. And so by doing this, you're saving some money on having to compensate for feed cost and things like that. So that's all I have on my portion of it. I was kind of flew through it because I want to make sure Brian has enough time to get through his. So I'll go ahead and hand it to you, Brian, and then we'll stop for questions at the end of that. You should be able to share, but let me know if you have an issue.
All right, there we go.
Perfect. Yep.
All right, good afternoon. So today I'm just going to talk about some of the economic considerations of AI. No, not the computer side. We're going to talk about artificial insemination on cattle. So this is something that Hannah and I had put together. There we go. So I'm going to kind of go through this a little quickly just so I don't keep you too long over time. But one of the things we can look at is who actually uses AI, right? And so typically what we see is larger producers are using AI more than smaller producers. So across the whole, all operations, about 11.6% of producers. Larger, so 200 or more cattle, are about 29%. And then small, 1 to 49 head, is about 8.7. So typically what we're seeing is larger producers. They can afford to kind of adopt this new technology, or not really new anymore, but this technology for their operation. And some of the considerations why even look at this is one of the big ones is it allows producers some access to superior genetics at a reduced cost. So there's a potential for that cow herd genetic improvement. Right? You don't have to go out and buy a really expensive bull. You can do AI and get those access to those better genetics a lot easier. Then your heavier, weaning weights, better replacements, again, improving your herd, having better weaning weights, having better weaning rates even. So right, more calves, as Dr. Anderson talked about, live calves is a big thing on profitability. So getting more, increasing your pregnancy rates and those kind of things is going to improve profitability. More selective breeding, right? Calving ease, milk production, all these different things. Sex semen allows you to do that with this with AI. And then one of the big things is increased uniformity, right? So there's some possible marketing opportunities based on uniformity, maybe capturing some premium based on being a little bit more uniform. And then again, improved conception rates, reduced bull requirements as well. And we'll go through some examples and comparing natural service to AI. Some studies, or at least one study that we've seen was 251 cows where they did this and they compared it to some natural service. And what happened, the AI increased calving rate by 9%, calving the first 30 days by 23%, cow crop weaned by 9%, weaning weight was up, and your calving season was reduced. So again, you're getting more calves, you're getting heavier calves with this technology. And so on the marketing side too, right? So we're getting more calves. There's a couple of studies that have found that uniformity can actually get you a little bit of a premium, right? Or Kansas State, they found lots of 40 calves. You get a little higher price for those. Uniform weight increased price by $2.11 per hundredweight. So again, if your calves are more similar in size, similar in weight, you can maybe capture a little bit of a premium. And this would be board of sale results. So if we increase or decrease that weight range, right, your low to your high in your calves by 50 pounds, you got an additional 75 cents per hundredweight. So again, ways that you can kind of increase your sale price of your calves just by making them a little bit more uniform. And with this technology, it kind of allows for some of that. Now, well, why doesn't everybody do it, right? There's always these barriers to any sort of new or different technology than what you're using, right? One of the big ones, cost. It's going to be more expensive than your natural service, a little bit more expensive. There's some labor requirements that are it's a lot more labor intensive than just putting a bull out there, right? And so increased labor, increased handling facilities. There's a lack of knowledge, right? You have to learn how to kind of do this. If you're going to do it yourself, or you got to go through classes and do that kind of stuff. And some people just think it's too much trouble, right? If it's a small producer, right, low input, continuous grazing, continuous calving, like that kind of management, low input management style, it's probably not really beneficial for them to have this additional labor and knowledge that they need to learn. It's probably not going to benefit them very much, right? Um, Another thing that we can kind of dictate some of this profitability is, sort of how is your bull to cow ratio? What price was your bull that you're buying? And that can all impact the cost of pregnancy of a natural service. And then when we compare it then to an AI, and we can see how those benefits can change. And so, if you have really expensive bull, not a lot of cows per bull, it's going to be a lot more expensive than a cheaper bull over a lot more cows. And so that trade-off again is what we'll talk about. But there's a trade-off there of how much you're using your bull. And so that kind of plays into that, does AI actually pay, right? And then I think kind of the main things is it really depends on the goals for the business, right? And so for producers that really want to improve their herd quality, improve their profitability, this is a viable option for that. Now we'll look at a couple examples, but it can be a viable option, but really each producer is so different, right? And so they have to determine if those increased costs are going to be worth it, right? And especially, how much is their time worth, right? And so that's kind of a big part of this is determining, does the producer want to put that extra time into doing this? And if the goal is just to kind of keep what you're doing the same thing, might not be the best option. And then it really depends on how those calves are going to be marketed. We'll look at some examples, but if you're able to capture a premium, then the increased uniformity becomes a little bit better for you. So what we're going to do is we'll do what we call a partial budget, right? So just looking at the revenues, costs, and ultimately net returns of one system and comparing it to another. So we're going to do that for natural service versus AI. And so I'm just going to look at one example here, like a 25 head. And so there's a lot of assumptions, and all these assumptions are going to impact whether or not this is profitable, right? And so when I give these talks to producers, I say you got to do your own examples because we'll show that all of these impact, right? Your pregnancy rate is going to impact it, your price is going to impact it, your bull cost, bull needs, how many cows you have, all these are going to impact it. But these are kind of the assumptions that we're using here. So, kind of what we're assuming here is that you're increasing with AI, you're increasing pregnancy rate by 5%, weaning weights by 25 pounds, and you're getting additional calf weaned. And then the AI costs per head. And again, this is going to vary across states and across, within a state too. And so having these costs and determining what that actual cost is really important. But this is kind of the 25 head example. Again, we're looking at natural service to AI. So I have some prices in there. I know prices are well above this now, but at these prices, we can see, our change in net returns to AI, it brought about $468.83 for this 25 head herd. So, not a whole lot per cow or per steer, but it provided some positive net returns, right? And I think that's kind of a point of this is just to show that there can be some, even for these smaller herds, right? And a lot of them are adopting them. There could be some potential benefits. Now, if we can also look at another example, right? Say you're able to capture the premium on top of this. So, right, we get a 2%, 2 cent premium per pound. That increases that net returns from AI to $658, right? So it increasing the value because again, you have one more calf and you have higher weights. That increases the value of that weight and that calf that you're getting. So again, that'll improve it. So higher prices are going to make AI more profitable. Lower prices was what we're going to see. Kind of does the opposite, right? So if we go back, 3, 4 years ago, we had a lot lower prices. And so if we kind of just look at lower prices, $1.50 per pound for steer, $1.25 for your heifer. In this case, AI didn't pay, right? And so that's a lot of those studies that were a couple years ago, prices were lower. It probably wasn't beneficial at that point in time, right? And so I like that David and Josh have mentioned this. But you can see here, the revenue for AI was $17,406. The revenue for natural service was 15,800, right? So AI had higher revenues, but because of the cost of AI, right, those additional costs that you have, your net returns was actually lower. So again, max revenue does not always mean max profitability. And so just understanding that also price is going to impact this pretty significantly. And so lower prices, you're just not gaining enough to pay for those the higher AI costs. And also, what we can also look at is, different herd sizes. So we also looked at higher, like larger herd sizes. So in this case, again, all I'm changing here, lower prices, but a 50 head example, it was ended up being positive. I know it's a small amount, but in this case, it's a positive net returns about, $90 here. So again, all these different variables that are in this sort of table are going to impact whether or not it's profitable to adopt this system. So really important, if somebody is thinking about doing this, they got to actually look at, different prices of all these, what different prices for your steers, heifers, those kind of things. What's your potential weight gain that you might get, right? Because everybody's a little bit different. You might not get 25 pounds. And so understanding that there's going to be some differences there and seeing sort of where those break evens are, right? How much are you actually going to have to gain in order for this to be profitable? What is the actual cost going to for AI? What's it actually going to cost me? And kind of getting those better idea of whether or not this is actually worth it for their operation. Oh, with that, I went through that kind of quickly. But if there's any questions for Hannah or I, I'd be happy to take them.
Yeah, right on time, Brian. 3 o'clock. We're good. Yeah, I know we are at 3 o'clock, but if anybody does have any questions about anything we've talked about in the session, please feel free to unmute or throw them in the chat and we can address them really quick. Or if you could please feel free to reach out to any one of us as well.
Hannah, I have a question.
Hey, Micah. Yeah.
So as an extension agent, we deal obviously with all kinds of people, different experience levels, knowledge levels, things like that. So my main question is, everyone keeps saying we have, the least amount of cattle that we've had in a very long time, blah, blah, blah. But yes, we are more efficient and we are producing just as much, if not a little bit more beef than we used to. But what is the best way to, answer that if we're approached and say, well, we're running out of cattle and that's why it's so expensive at the store.
So what's your question? Like how to answer that?
Yeah, like if a client that just isn't really knowledgeable comes up and, because I get it quite a bit, as far as they complain, they might not be necessarily cattle, influence, and they want to always ask about prices of beef because they think that that's, I feel like what maybe my job revolves around, which partially yes, but also no. So if you were to, what's the best way that you think, approaching that topic to where you're educating them, but it's also, thrown in a little bit of, well, that's not really how this works.
Yeah.
I don't know if that made it any better.
No, that's okay. And these guys can help me out, I think. But for people who don't have a cattle background, I think it is really important to educate them on how the whole cycle and system works and the timeline, especially of beef production.
Right.
Like you said, we're at the lowest cattle numbers we've been at in over 70 years, and that's not going to change overnight, even when we do enter that expansion and rebuild phase. I mean, if we keep heifers now, she's not going to calve till 2026, wean 2027, and enter beef production 28, maybe 29. So
Right.
I think explaining that timeline to people as well is a good place to start. And I don't know, Josh, Brian, if y'all want
Yeah,
to.
because that's where my thing is. I don't ever know where to start, kind of when they ask or they have something along those lines, but that's a good point.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Hannah. The only thing I would add in there is, I do think we've seen demand improve as well at the same time that we've seen supplies, get tighter. And a big part of this story is people's demand for beef is stronger now than it was even 20 years ago.
Mhm.
So it's really it's supply driven. I don't want to overshadow that right now because we do have the tight supplies, but it's also that people really like beef.
Thank you.
Absolutely. That's a good point. Any other questions? I know we're a little bit over, but that's okay. If not, like all the other sessions, they have been recorded and they'll be uploaded to the link I've sent out previously along with our presentations. Don't ever hesitate to reach out with us with other questions. Thank you all for just joining in on this series, whether you've been at all of them or just one of them or a couple. We hope you've enjoyed it and taken something from it and are able to use it in your programming to help your producers. Thank you, Brian, Josh, and David for being here today for the final session and all that you presented. Yeah, it's been great, and I look forward to doing something like this again in the future. So with that, I will wish everyone a good rest of their day, and don't hesitate to reach out with questions. And please take the survey in the chat, please. Thank y'all very much. We'll see you later.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thanks, Anna.
Bye.